There is a version of Mick Jagger that the world thinks it knows. The strut, the lips, the dangerous smirk aimed at 50,000 people who are already screaming before he opens his mouth. The man who turned a concert stage into a personal kingdom, who made rebellion look like choreography, who somehow became both the face of chaos and the architect of one of the longest running operations in rock and roll history. That version is real, but it is not where the story begins. The story begins somewhere quieter, somewhere ordinary, somewhere that looks almost nothing like the man who would emerge from it. It begins in Dartford, a market town in Kent, England in the year 1943. It begins with a boy named Michael Philip Jagger, born on the 26th of July, the son of a physical education teacher and a hairdresser. It begins with terraced streets, with the smell of post-war England still clinging to everything, with a childhood that was stable and unremarkable in almost every way that mattered on the surface. And it begins with something burning underneath that surface, something the boy himself could not yet name, something that would take years of searching before it finally found its shape. This is the story of the young Mick Jagger that nobody remembers, not the icon, not the headline, not the caricature, the boy before the myth, the teenager before the attitude, the young man who was told in more ways than one that the thing he wanted most was simply not available to someone like him, and who decided quietly, ferociously, and without fanfare that they were wrong. Dartford was not the kind of place that produced legends. It was the kind of place that produced accountants, schoolteachers, men who wore sensible shoes and came home at the same time every evening. The town sat southeast of London, close enough to the capital to feel its gravitational pull, far enough to exist entirely outside its glamour. For a boy with ambition and restlessness already crackling in his chest, it was both a starting point and a cage. Basil Fanchai Jagger, known as Joe, was Mick's father, a disciplined, health-conscious man who believed in structure, in physical rigor, in the kind of self-improvement that could be measured and tracked. Eva, his mother, was warmer, more social, a woman who loved music and paid attention to the way things looked. Between the two of them, they raised a boy who was smarter than he let on, more curious than he appeared, and quietly furious at the ordinariness of the world being offered to him. At Maypole County Primary School, young Michael was remembered as bright, engaged, and quick. He was not a troublemaker in the conventional sense. He did not throw things or shout or pick fights. His rebellion at that age was internal, invisible, a slow, burning awareness that the life mapped out for him and the life he actually wanted had almost nothing in common. He could not have told you yet what that other life looked like. He just knew that it existed somewhere and that Dartford was not it. What it did have, however, was music. In the early 1950s, music was changing in ways that most adults in England either did not notice or actively chose to ignore. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in the American South, and in the cities where Black Americans had carried their culture through decades of migration, something extraordinary was happening. Rhythm and blues, gospel electricity poured into secular songs. The blues twisted and amplified until it became something new and almost violent with energy. Names like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Little Richard, Chuck Berry. Sounds that felt like the opposite of everything polite English society stood for. Young Michael Jagger found those sounds, and they found him, and the collision was permanent. He was somewhere around 11 or 12 years old when he first encountered American rhythm and blues in any serious way. The exact records passed between boys in the way all contraband moves, quietly, urgently, with the shared understanding that this was something the adults around them would not approve of, and that disapproval was part of the appeal. Not all of it, but part of it, because the music itself was the larger part. It was honest in a way that the tidy, scrubbed popular music of Britain in that era simply was not. It had weight, it had feeling, it had a physical pulse that you could not ignore, even if you wanted to. He wanted more of it, He started collecting records with the focused intensity of someone who had recognized something essential in the sound and needed to possess it, to understand it, to get inside it. He studied the voices, he studied the rhythms, he studied the way those American singers moved inside a song, the way they bent notes, the way they inhabited a lyric not as words on a page, but as something physical and alive. Nobody in Dartford was particularly impressed by this. It was eccentric at best, slightly troubling at worst. This was not where you expected a nice English boy from a respectable family to spend his attention, but it was where Michael Jagger spent his. Then came the morning that would eventually change everything, though neither of the two boys involved could have possibly understood that on the day it happened. It was 1961. Michael Jagger was 17 years old and had recently enrolled at the London School of Economics after performing well enough on his school examinations to earn a place there. He was on a train platform at Dartford station, carrying a stack of imported American rhythm and blues records under his arm. Albums he had ordered through the mail from the United States of America at considerable personal expense. He ran into a boy he had known years earlier at primary school, a boy named Keith Richards, who had since been attending a different school and living a slightly rougher version of teenage life. Keith Richards looked at the records. He recognized them, not just the format, but specifically those albums, Muddy Waters, Chuck Berry, records that were not easy to find in England, that required effort and dedication and a certain kind of obsession to track down. The two boys started talking, and they did not stop for a very long time. What Keith Richards saw in those records was a mirror of his own private passion. What Mick Jagger saw in Keith Richards was the first person he had met who understood exactly why those records mattered, who felt their pull with the same urgency, who heard in that American sound not just music, but a different way of being alive in the world. They were not friends yet. They were not bandmates yet. They were not anything yet except two teenagers on a train platform in Dartford, recognizing each other across the ordinary noise of suburban English life. But the recognition itself was the beginning of everything. The London School of Economics was not entirely wasted on Mick Jagger. He was genuinely intelligent, and the institution offered him something beyond academics, a proximity to London itself, to its clubs and its culture and the early stirrings of something that would later be called the British youth. He moved between Dartford and London with increasing frequency, spending more and more time in the city, absorbing more and more of what was beginning to happen there. But he never truly belonged to the world of lectures and seminars and career trajectories. The life of a respectable professional, of an economist or a businessman in the conventional sense, was something he could perform convincingly enough in front of his father, but it was never the life he was building toward in his own mind. He was building toward something else. He did not know precisely what it was. He only knew that the records were pointing him somewhere, and Keith Richards was pointing him somewhere, and together those two directions were leading him away from Dartford and towards something he could feel but not yet see. Reconnected with Keith, Mick began spending time in a circle that included Brian Jones, a guitarist from Cheltenham who was older, more experienced, and possessed of a musical sophistication that was unusual in England at the time. Jones was already deeply committed to the blues, specifically the Chicago electric blues tradition, and he was actively trying to form a band around that sound. He had placed an advertisement in a music publication seeking like-minded musicians. When Mick and Keith found their way into that circle, something clicked. Not immediately, not perfectly, but something clicked. Mick Jagger in those very early days was not the frontman anyone would have predicted. He was lean, restless, physically awkward in that particular way of very young men whose bodies are still catching up with their ambitions. He was smart and he was hungry, and he clearly felt the music in some deep and genuine way. But he was not commanding. He was not magnetic. He was not yet what he would become. What he had, however, was a voice that worked. Not a conventional voice, not a trained voice, not the kind of clean, controlled instrument that music teachers in England in the early 1960s would have recognized as something worth developing. It was a voice that sounded American in ways that young English boys' voices were not supposed to sound. It had grit. It had swagger that preceded the body language that would later make it famous. It had a quality of feeling that you could not teach and could not fake. The quality of someone who had spent years listening to music that told the truth and had absorbed that commitment to truth into his own sound. He did not fully know it yet. That was perhaps the most important thing about the young Mick Jagger that history tends to overlook. He was not walking around Dartford or London in those years with the quiet confidence of someone who knew what was coming. He was uncertain. He was searching. He was trying things and failing at them and trying again. He was showing up to rehearsals in cramped London flats and being told he needed to work harder, that his timing was off, that the voice was interesting, but the performance was not there yet. He heard those criticisms and he absorbed them, and he went home and he worked. That is the version of Mick Jagger that nobody tells you about. Not the natural, not the effortless talent who emerged fully formed from the south of England like some kind of rock and roll miracle. The version who was told he was not ready. The version who was not sure he was ready. The version who showed up anyway. Brian Jones had assembled around himself a loose collection of musicians that included, in addition to Mick and Keith, a bassist named Dick Taylor, who would later leave to pursue other projects. They rehearsed in borrowed spaces. They played their American blues with the obsessive devotion of converts who had found the only religion that made sense to them. And they began slowly to take that music out of rehearsal rooms and onto actual stages. The first time Mick Jagger sang in front of an audience, it was not a triumphant moment. It was a small club, a handful of people, the kind of setting where nobody famous has ever been remembered. He was nervous in ways that the older, more iconic version of himself would have found almost unrecognizable. His voice worked. His movement was stiff. The confidence that would eventually become his defining characteristic was not yet present in any visible way. He knew it. He could feel the gap between what he was doing and what the music required. He could hear the distance between his performance and the recordings he had been studying for years, the Muddy Waters records, the Chuck Berry records, the sounds that had first grabbed him by something in his chest and refused to let go. That knowledge was not discouraging. It was infuriating, and the fury was useful. It sent him back to the work. It sent him back to the records, to the mirror, to the rehearsal room, to the stage again and again and again. Every substandard performance became information. Every moment where the audience looked away, instead of leaning in, became a data point in an ongoing experiment that had only one acceptable outcome. He was not trying to become famous. He was not yet thinking in those terms. He was trying to close the gap between what the music demanded and what he was capable of delivering. The fame, if it ever came, would be a consequence. The music was the point. Around 1962, the loose collective of blues enthusiasts that included Mick, Keith, and Brian Jones began to take on a more defined shape. They played at the Marquee Club in London, one of the central venues in the emerging British rhythm and blues scene, where young audiences were beginning to discover for themselves the music that a handful of obsessives had been championing for years. The bill that night listed the performers as the Rolling Stones, a name Brian Jones had pulled from a Muddy Waters song. The reception was not immediately overwhelming. They were not the headline act. They were not anybody's first choice for anything. They were a group of young men playing American blues music with an intensity that some people found thrilling and others found slightly uncomfortable, which even then seemed like exactly the right response to be generating. But the real story of that period was not the performances. The performances were the surface. Underneath the surface, Something more fundamental was happening in Mick Jagger specifically, something that would take years to fully manifest, but was already beginning to shape itself. He was learning how to be a performer, not just how to sing, not just how to stand on a stage, but how to create a relationship between himself and an audience that was something more than the simple transaction of musician and listener. He was learning, through trial and constant error, how to make a room pay attention, how to make silence work as hard as sound, how to use his body as an extension of the music rather than a separate thing that happened to be present while the music played. He was learning this from the records, from James Brown, who understood that the body was an instrument as important as any guitar, from Little Richard, who treated performance as a form of controlled explosion, from Muddy Waters, who could make an entire room hold its breath simply by the way he positioned himself at a microphone. These were masters of a discipline that had no formal school, no curriculum, no certification. The only way to learn it was to watch and practice, and fail, and watch again. Mick Jagger watched, he practiced, he failed, he watched again, and slowly, over the course of months that stretched into years, the gap began to close. But before the gap closed, there was a period of profound uncertainty that tends to get edited out of the official story, because the official story requires the hero to have always known, on some level, that they were destined for greatness. The official story is uncomfortable with the version where the future icon spent significant amounts of time genuinely unsure whether he had what it took. Mick Jagger was not sure, not in 1962, not really in 1963. The band was developing, but so were dozens of other bands in London at the same time. And the competition was real, and the stakes felt enormous, and the window for any of this to actually work felt narrow in ways that were terrifying if you looked at them directly. His parents were not enthusiastic about the direction his life was taking. His father, the disciplined physical education teacher who believed in structure and measurable self-improvement, watched his son's growing commitment to rock and roll with something between concern and active disapproval. The London School of Economics was a real institution offering a real future. The Smoky clubs where his son was spending his evenings were not a real anything, as far as Joe Jagger was concerned. The conversations at home during that period were not comfortable ones. Mick was expected, by the standards of his family and his class and his time, to be moving toward something respectable. What he was moving toward instead was something that respectable England had not yet decided how to categorize, and the uncertainty itself was a kind of social verdict. You do not pursue things that cannot be categorized unless you are willing to be categorized along with them as something suspect, something outside the normal order of things. He was willing, but the willingness cost something. It required him to hold his own conviction against the weight of everyone else's doubt, including, on the worst nights, his own. There is a particular kind of loneliness in being sure about something that no one around you can see yet. It is not the dramatic loneliness of great suffering. It is quieter than that, and in some ways harder to carry, because it does not announce itself or demand sympathy. It just sits there, day after day, in the gap between the life you are living and the life you are reaching toward, waiting to see which one wins. Mick Jagger carried that loneliness through Dartford, and through London, and through the rehearsal rooms, and through the early shows where the audiences were small and the response was uncertain, and the future was genuinely, completely open. He also carried something else, something that the uncertainty and the doubt, and the parental disapproval and the long nights of not quite good enough could not touch. He carried the music, the actual physical, emotional reality of the records he had been listening to since he was a boy. The music was not an argument. It did not need to defend itself against his father's skepticism or the conventional world's indifference. It simply existed fully and completely, and it told him something that no other voice in his life at that time was telling him. It told him that feeling this much about something was not a mistake. that the hunger he felt was not a symptom of some personal disorder, but a signal pointing toward something real and important. That the road from Dartford station, from those records tucked under a teenager's arm, went somewhere. He did not know where. He could not have predicted the stadiums or the headlines or the decades of music that would follow. He could not have imagined the Rolling Stones as they would eventually exist as a cultural institution capable of filling the largest venues on Earth 50 years after they played their first small club show. None of that was available to him as a vision. He was just a boy from Dartford who loved the blues and was willing to embarrass himself in front of small audiences in smoky rooms in order to get better at something he could not stop caring about. That is the part nobody remembers. That is the part that tends to disappear in the light of everything that followed. But it matters. It matters enormously because it is the part that made everything else possible. By 1963, the Rolling Stones had begun to attract the attention of Andrew Loog Oldham, a 19-year-old music publicist with a sharp eye for what the market wanted and an even sharper instinct for how to position a band against the dominant trends of the moment. Oldham saw the Stones not as a blues band, not as what they understood themselves to be, but as something the pop music world had not yet produced in its current form, a genuine alternative to the Beatles. The Beatles were beloved, polished, charming. They made parents nervous in manageable ways. They were the kind of rebellion you could bring home for Sunday dinner. What Oldham saw in the Rolling Stones, and specifically in Mick Jagger, was something that could not be brought home for Sunday dinner. Something that was not interested in being manageable. He told them to stop smiling so much. He told Mick to be more difficult, more threatening, more like the thing you warned your daughter about, rather than the thing you introduced to your daughter. He told them to lean into everything that made comfortable England uncomfortable. The advice aligned perfectly with what Mick Jagger had been moving toward anyway, not because he was performing danger, but because the danger was real. The restlessness that had been building since Dartford, the refusal to accept the ordinary life that was expected of him, the years of working toward something that the people around him could not see and therefore could not validate. All of that had produced in Mick Jagger a genuine edge that did not need to be manufactured. Oldham simply gave him permission to stop hiding it. And once Mick Jagger stopped hiding it, the world noticed in a way that changed everything. But here is what the world never quite understood about what it was noticing. It was not watching a performance of rebellion. It was watching the result of years of private, unglamorous, often humiliating work. It was watching the payoff of the train platform in Dartford, of the stack of American records, of the rehearsal rooms, and the small clubs and the long nights of not quite good enough. It was watching everything that had accumulated in a boy who was told he would never make it and decided, without drama and without announcement, to prove that estimation wrong. The swagger that would eventually become legendary was not something Mick Jagger was born with. It was something he built. He built it from the blues records and the stage failures and the parental skepticism and the years of carrying his own conviction through the ordinary world's indifference. He built it from every night he showed up when he was not sure he was ready and performed anyway and went home and worked harder. He built it, most of all, from the knowledge, hard, won and never fully comfortable, that the life you want is not given to you. It is extracted, piece by piece, from the raw material of rejection and doubt and the willingness to keep going when every reasonable voice in your world is suggesting that you stop. The boy from Dartford, who nobody remembers, was building the icon that everyone knows. He was building him slowly, quietly, without a roadmap or a guarantee or anyone's particular blessing. In the rehearsal rooms and on the small stages and in the long, silent hours with the records that had first told him the truth about what music could be. That boy was not fearless. He was afraid plenty. He was uncertain plenty. He was wrong about things and embarrassed by things, and rejected by things that mattered to him. But he was also something else, something that the fear and the uncertainty and the rejection could never quite extinguish. He was absolutely, completely, irreversibly convinced that the music was worth it, that the gap between where he was and where the music required him to be was a gap worth closing, that Dartford was a beginning and not a destiny. And in the end, the conviction was right, not because conviction always wins, it does not, but because this particular conviction was attached to this particular person, who had something in him that the years of doubt had only sharpened rather than destroyed. A quality of attention, a quality of hunger, a quality of refusal, the refusal to settle, the refusal to be what other people's limited imagination had decided he was, the refusal, most essentially, to accept that the boy with the records on the train platform was not already, in some fundamental way, on his way to becoming something the world had not yet seen. When the Rolling Stones finally broke through in 1963 and 1964, when the audiences grew from dozens to thousands, and then to tens of thousands, when the newspapers started writing about Mick Jagger's lips and his movements, and the particular quality of menace he carried onto a stage, the story that got told was a story about arrival, about a natural talent stepping into the spotlight he was always meant to occupy. The story that did not get told was about everything that preceded the arrival. The years of practice, the years of failure, the years of showing up to small rooms and giving everything he had, and knowing it was not yet enough. The years of carrying the music through the ordinary world's skepticism and his own doubt, and the relentless pressure to abandon the whole improbable project and become something sensible. That is the young Mick Jagger that nobody remembers. The one who was not yet an icon. The one who was just a boy from a market town in Kent who had found something in an American record that told him the truth about what he wanted, and who spent years in the unglamorous work of becoming worthy of that truth. He made it. But first, for a long time, he had to be willing not to. He had to be willing to do the work without the guarantee, to build without the blueprint, to believe without the evidence. And that, in the end, is the part of the story that matters most, not the stadiums, not the hits, not the decades of survival and reinvention and cultural endurance. Those are the consequences. The story is what came before them. The story is Dartford. The story is the records on the train platform. The story is the rehearsal rooms and the small stages and the long nights of building something that nobody around you can yet see. The story is the boy who was told he would never make it, and who used that information as fuel, and who kept going, and who became, in the fullness of time, the man who made rock music feel dangerous. He had been dangerous from the beginning. The world just needed a few years to catch up.